Hey everyone, welcome to the CSS for Beginners crash course, where you will learn everything you need to know about styling websites with CSS. What exactly is CSS? It stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's the language we use to style HTML documents. Think of HTML as the structure of a house, and CSS as everything that makes it look good: the paint, the decorations, and layout. Let's look at a simple example. Here's a basic HTML page without CSS. This is HTML. You can see what it renders as over here. As you can see, it's pretty plain. Now let's add some CSS in three different ways. First, I'll add inline CSS. So right within the HTML tag, I can put style equals, and then I can put the CSS here. So I'll do color, blue, font size, 32 pixels. So the CSS is a series of properties and values. So the color property is value blue, the font size property has value 32. So just refresh and we can see now the H1 tag has color blue and it's size 32. So that was inline CSS where we put right within an HTML tag. But I'm going to take that out because now we're going to use internal CSS by adding it to the head section. So I just put this CSS right in the head section. So we have an opening style tag, a closing style tag, and then we have our selector. So for H1 tags, the color is going to be blue, the font size is going to be 32. And for paragraph tags, the color is going to be gray, and then we can assign a font family. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, you can see the headings stay the same, but we saw the paragraph change. So there's three ways to create the CSS: inline, internal, and then the final way is external, with an external CSS file. This is the most recommended approach. So I'm going to create a new file called styles.css, and I'm going to put this CSS into this file. And then I'm going to go back to the HTML file. I'm actually going to delete all this internal CSS. And now we can see how we connect it. We use the link tag. It's a style sheet, type text/CSS, and then href styles.css. So that's going to be the link to our file. So if I refresh the page, it's going to look exactly the same because we're putting the CSS in the styles.css file instead of the index.html file. This separating the files keeps your styles separate from your HTML, making your code more maintainable and usable. Now that we understand how to include CSS in a project, let's learn about selectors and properties, the building blocks of CSS rules. I've created a new project to demonstrate different types of selectors. And so you can see in our HTML file, we have a div that has a class of container, a paragraph tag. We also have another paragraph tag with a class of highlight, paragraph tag with an ID of special, and we have a class of box down here. And when we linked our CSS, we did it in a slightly different way. We don't actually have to put the type of the file on here. So let's go to our CSS and see what it looks like. So starting off, we have this element selector. This targets all instances of an HTML element. In this case, any paragraph elements. So if we go over here, we can see the paragraph elements, and all those paragraph elements now have this format. And now we have our class selector. This starts with a dot. So it says dot highlight. This applies CSS rules to any element that has the class of highlight. So if you go over here, we can see this has the class of highlight. So we're going to make the background color yellow, and the padding is going to be 10 pixels, which I'll explain more later, but basically there's some extra room around this text here. And then we have the ID selector. It starts with the pound sign or hash mark or number symbol, and this is how we select ID. So we have the ID of special. So that's right here. And so that special paragraph is going to be read with a font weight of bold. And then we have this descendant selector. So we see we have two selectors. So first, we have class of box, and then we have an anchor tag or a link tag that comes after, that's comes within the box class. So if we go back over to here, we can see we have the class, the box class here, and then we have the anchor tag within the box class. And so that is going to be a color green and have text decoration none. So this is the link right here. And then we see this hover pseudo class. So this will style whenever the mouse hovers over an anchor tag, it's going to underline. So that's why when I move my mouse over here, it underlines that link. Understanding selectors is very important because they determine which elements your CSS rules will affect. The more specific your selector, the higher its specificity, which brings us to our next topic, specificity rules. Specificity follows this hierarchy. Inline styles, that's when we put the styles right within the tag, that always comes first. Then any styles that apply to an ID, then any styles that apply to classes, attributes, and pseudo classes, and finally, elements and pseudo elements, which is the lowest in the hierarchy. Now let's dive into one of the most fundamental aspects of CSS, working with colors and text. These are often the first properties developers learn because they make such a visible impact on our websites. So let's first look at the different ways we can specify colors in CSS. So, just so you know, for all these colors, you can see a box, a square that has the color. That is a special extension I have in Visual Studio Code. By default, it's not going to show that, but there are different extensions that can make working with CSS even easier. So we can use a color name, just put the word red here, or we can have the hexadecimal of the color red, or the RGB, or the RGB with opacity. So this is at 50% opacity. And then we can use HSL, hue, saturation, lightness, or HSLA with opacity. And you can see, since I'm in Visual Studio Code, if I put my mouse over this, it allows me to I could actually change this. Now let's see a practical example that combines colors and typography. So we have this HTML here, we link the style sheet, we have a Google font. So this is just a font that we can load from a website that's provided by Google. And we have the different CSS classes here. And if we go to the styles.css, we can see what we have here. So let's talk about some important typography properties that we use. First of all, we have font family for everything within the body. Now, the font family determines the typeface. Always include a fallback. So we're using Roboto, and their fallback is sans serif. And the way our browser knows about the font is because we loaded it right here. And the fallback is in case the primary font fails to load. And then we have some other things you can see here, but I'm going to show font size. So font size, here we have 2.5 rem. So there's different units you can use for the font size. You can use px, which are pixels, a fixed size. You can use em, which means it's relative to the parent element, or rem, that's what we're using here. That means it's relative to the root element, or we can just use percent, and percent is going to be a percentage of the parent element. Then we have line height. Here in this case, it's 1.6. That controls the space between lines of text. using a unitless value like 1.6 is best practice as it scales with the font size. So we can see other things like margin bottom, which is going to add some space at the end of this main title, Welcome to Typography. Letter spacing is going to decrease the space because it's a negative between each letter. And we also have things like text align, which in this case applies to, well, let's see what the text sample is. Text sample is, this is a sample paragraph with custom styling. And we have text align justify. This describes how inline contents of a block are horizontally aligned if the contents do not completely fill the align box. And we can see how this box is different than this box, partly because of the text align justify. We also have a background color, and the border radius here we can see makes it rounded on the corner of this box. And you can actually create custom fonts. Let me show you how you would do that. If we can use the font face like this to create a custom font. We're going to call it custom font, and we need to have a URL to the font here. And then we can specify the weight, the style, and then we can use it in our CSS by just naming it here for the font family. And let's look at one more example. So here we have a few different classes. We have the blog post class, the article title class, the article meta class, and then we can see how we're styling all that here. Here we're using some new things like max width, which constrains content, the width to a certain range. And some other new things we're using are things like font style to make this italic, with a font size, a border left. We're putting this blue line here with border left, and we're adding some padding on the left to add some extra space here. And this just provides another example for you. Now we're going to learn about one of the most fundamental concepts in CSS, the box model. Every element on a web page is essentially a rectangular box, and understanding how these boxes work is important for layout and spacing. We've kind of alluded to this already, but let's look at this. We have this box, and let's see how it's styled. You can see what it looks like over here, but there's a few key sections to the box model. There's the content, which we've styled with this. The content is the actual content area where your text and images appear. And so in this case, the box is 300 pixels by 150 pixels large. Then we have the padding. The padding is the space between the content and the border. So you can see the space above this text, the space to the left of this text. And then we have the border, which is a blue line all the way around. And then we have the margin, which is the space outside of the border. So here's a different way to apply the properties. So before we had padding, border, margin, but now we can also do padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left, border top, border right, border bottom, border left. And you can see how it looks different here. Margin top, margin right, so we can do each side individually. And there's also shorthand notation. So if you just do padding 20 pixels, all sides will be equal. But if you do padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels, that's going to be the top and bottom, and then the left and right. Or you can do 4 values, which are all the values going around clockwise. Now let's quickly talk about box sizing. This property changes how the width and height of an element are calculated. So basically, with the box sizing of content box, it's going to add, the width is going to be separate from the padding. So we have the width of 300 pixels. we have the 40 pixels padding because that's 20 pixels on each side. And then we have 5 pixels on each side for the border. So the entire width is actually going to be 350 pixels for this example. But if we use box sizing of border box, it's the width is going to be the total width, and the padding and the border will just be inside of the total width. It's common to set the box sizing with setting it globally. To set something globally, you put an asterisk and then put all the CSS within there, and that's going to apply that whatever's in here is going to apply to every element on the page. And here's another example with the box model. We've created a card, and you can see with the card header, the card body, card footer, and we're using the margin a lot. We're using padding. We're using the margin, and we have to use different parts of the box model to make sure everything is spaced out how we want. And there's some new things here like box shadow. So you can see there's kind of a shadow coming from this card. And you can see first we're showing how big the shadow is going to be and then what color the shadow is. And then another new thing here is we can assign what the cursor is going to look like when it's over the button. See, it's going to look like a pointer if we move the cursor over the button. Now, one thing you can see this always stays in the middle. That's because of this margin 20 auto. So auto is auto calculating it so it stays right in the middle. Okay, now let's look at how we create this grid of boxes. We have all of them are within the class grid, and each of them have a class of grid item. And if we change the size, you can see how the boxes change sizes. So if we go to the styles, we can see that we're using display flex and flex wrap. So even though there's just 4 in a row, they're actually doing 2 here and 2 here because they're wrapping to the next line, and we're using a gap of 20 pixels, padding of 20 pixels. And for each grid item, we're actually using a calculation. So basically 50% of the total width minus 10 pixels. Now we'll cover the fundamental properties that control how elements are positioned and displayed on a web page. We'll look at display, position, float, and z-index properties. So let's start with the display properties. So we can see we have this class block, inline block, and hidden. And then we can see that we have this is display block, display inline block, and hidden is display none. So if we move this around, we can see how they behave differently depending on the display property. Now let's look at positioning. The position property has 5 values: static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. So you can see how these different ones behave. Now I added some more text to the page, so we can see how these elements behave when we can scroll the page. See, the sticky header scrolls and then it stays as a header, and the fixed element just stays there no matter what. So now you have a better understanding of what these different positions do. Now let's talk about z-index and stacking contexts. So basically we just have 3 boxes here, and if we go to the style, we can see that we have z-index 1, that's box 1, z-index 2, and then box 3 is z-index 3. And you can see the lower z-index is on the bottom for the layer, and the greater z-index is on the top above everything else. Now let's look at float and clear properties. This image has a class of float left, and so we have the float left property, and you can see it makes the image float to the left of the text. And we have a div class clear, so anything after this clear won't float anymore. So if I put something here, we can see that will appear after the image. And you can create a similar thing using this display table clear both. Now let's talk about a very powerful layout tool in CSS called Flexbox. Before Flexbox, creating certain layouts was incredibly difficult and often required hacky solutions. Flexbox changed all that by introducing a more intuitive way to create flexible, responsive layouts. Think of Flexbox like a way to organize items in a container, similar to how you might organize items in a box. You can line them up horizontally or vertically, space them out evenly, or stack them in different ways. So here's a simple example. We can see we have the Flex container, and then we have these three items, Flex item. Let's go look at what the style looks like. We can see the containers have display Flex. When we set display flex on an element, two important things happen. One, the element becomes a flex container, and two, all of its direct children become flex items. So you can see how these flex items show up within the flex container. So let me tell you about some other properties we can use on the Flex container. One is the direction. So right now we have the default direction, which is row. So if I add row here, it's going to look exactly the same because that's the default direction. The Flex direction property sets up two important concepts. The main axis, which is the primary direction items flow, and the cross axis, the perpendicular to the main axis. When flex direction is row, the main axis is left to right, and the cross axis is top to bottom. When the flex direction is column, then the main axis is top to bottom, and the cross axis is left to right. We can also do row reverse, and it says 1, 2, 3. Now it's 1, 2, 3 from the other direction. And we can do column reverse, which is the same with columns. Now it's 1, 2, 3 instead of, or it's 3, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3. Now let's talk about wrapping. So by default, we have flex wrap is wrap. So this will wrap items to the next line if needed. To make it more obvious, let's add a few more items. And you can see how these wrap to the next line. And if we change the size of the window, they wrap differently. We could also use no wrap, and they just keep going off the side of the screen. But we can scroll over to see all of them. And then we can have wrap reversed, where it starts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9. Now let's talk about aligning items. We have two powerful properties: justify content, which aligns items along the main axis, and cross and align items, which aligns items along the cross axis. So flex start aligns items at the start, so that's basically the default. But we can also do flex end, and now they're justifying on the right side of the end of the content. We also have center, which justifies in the center, and space between. So you can see the space in between each item is the same, and space around. So it's going to have some space on the sides here, and then space evenly. So space around it equals space around the items. Space evenly is equal space on both sides of the items. Now for the align items properly, the default is stretch, which stretches to fill the container height. And to make this more obvious, let's add a height here. Okay, so now you can see these stretching out. We can also use flex start. This will align at the start of the cross axis, so you can see what that looks like. And we can do flex end, which will align at the end of the cross axis, so toward the bottom. We can also align in the center, so that's pretty self-explanatory in the center. And then we can align at the baseline. So if we align at the baseline, we can see what that looks like. Now let's look at properties for individual flex items. Here's what's with flex grow 1. This is how much the items will grow. It's basically how much of the extra space the item should take relative to other items. So we can see what happens when we adjust the window size. And flex shrink is how much I have to shrink when there's not enough space. We also have flex basis, which is the starting size before growing or shrinking. Here's flex basis at 10 pixels, or we can do it at 100 pixels. And that's what that looks like for flex basis. Now here's a practical example that combines these concepts. We have a nav bar with a logo, we have these nav links here, and then we have the nav button. You can see the button always stays on the side there. If we go to the styles, we can see what's happening. So the nav bar is our container, display flex, space between, a line item center with the padding. And then for the nav links, we have display flex. And we also have gap is to rem. This is a modern way to add space between items. It adds space between flex items without affecting the outer margins. Some things to remember about Flexbox: it's one dimensional, either row or column. The Flex container controls layout of direct children. Flex items can grow and shrink. And some things it's great for are navigation bars, card layouts, centering content, equal height columns, and dynamic spacing. Now let's talk about CSS Grid. Unlike Flexbox, which works in one dimension, Grid allows us to work in two dimensions simultaneously, both rows and columns. Think of it like designing a spreadsheet where you have complete control over how cells can be sized, positioned, and organized. So let's start with the fundamental building blocks. We can see in this example code, we have the grid container and then we have some grid items. So if we go and look over at the styles, the CSS, we can see the container is display grid. And so the display grid establishes a grid context. Then we also have this grid template columns. So this defines our column structure. And so basically this is going to repeat two items, and each item, this is how much space it's going to be. So the FR units is basically sharing the available space. So if each unit is one FR unit, they will each take the same amount of space. If let's say there's 3 items in this row, if the first item was 2 FR units and the second item was 1 FR unit, this would be twice as long as the second item. So we also have the gap here. So the gap is going to create space between grid items. So let's talk more about the FR item, the FR unit. FR actually stands for fraction, and it is unique to grid. So I could actually change this and put 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And so it's going to do 3 columns. They're each about the same. Now, if I put this into 2 and see the 2FR, 1FR, you can see, like I was saying before, this is the length of like 2/3, and this is 1/3. And I could add another 1FR to make there be 3 columns. We can also combine fixed width with flexible columns. So we can see the first column is 100 pixels, then we have 1FR, 1FR. And if I change this, you can even see it better. One of Grid's most powerful features is the ability to create automatically responsive layouts. So if we look at this one right here, let me show you what happens if I change how big this is. See, there's 3 columns, 2 columns, 1 column. So let's understand this pattern. AutoFit tells Grid to figure out how many columns can fit. And then we have this min-max 250 pixels 1FR. That makes columns at least 250 pixels wide. If there's extra space, grow them equally. If there's not enough space for multiple columns, create 1 column. And then we're going to repeat this for all the items. Let's look at this section right here, grid template area. These provide a visual way to lay out content. It's like drawing a map of your layout. And then we assign areas to the different elements. To really understand how this works, Let me make this website bigger. Now, if we look at the template area, see header, header, header. So there's 3 columns of header. And then in the next row, there's sidebar, then main, main. So here's sidebar, and then 2 sections of the main content. And then there's 3 columns of the footer here. And then you can see we use the grid template columns and the grid template rows to determine how big the columns and rows are going to be. And we can set the min height, the gap, and the padding. And like I said before, it's very responsive. So it's nice with the grid template area that you can kind of see the layout in the code. And it's easy to reorganize for different screen sizes. It makes complex layouts more manageable. So here's where it gets redefined with the responsive layout. So when it's a narrower screen, it's going to be header, sidebar, main, footer. Now let's talk about grid alignment properties. This is a pretty powerful aspect of CSS Grid that allows us to control how items are positioned both individually and as a group. So we have this simple example right now, and we're going to add the alignment properties. So there's 2 main categories of alignment in Grid. Item alignment, which are how items align within their grid cells, and content alignment, which is how the entire grid aligns within its container. So let's start with justify items and align items. These control individual items within their grid cells. So now we're justifying center, which is horizontal alignment, and align items center, which is vertical alignment. You can see how it changed what's happening over here. So besides center, we can use start. So now they're all both at the beginning, or this can be start. We can also use end, and we can use stretch. So here's what stretch looks like. Notice how changing these values affects all items in the grid. This is particularly useful when you want consistent alignment across your layout. Now let's look at justify content and align content. These properties control how the entire grid sits within the container. So if I refresh this, we're justifying content with space between, which is the maximum space between grid tracks, and then align content, which is the vertical grid alignment. We are aligning in the center. We can also use start, which aligns to the start of the container. We can use end, which aligns to the end of the container. There's center, there's space between. And so this is going to have the maximum space between grid tracks. We also have space around, and I'm switching between the justify content and align content so you can kind of see the difference. So that has equal space between the grid tracks, and then we have the space evenly, which is going to have equal space between and around the grid tracks. The key difference here is that we're moving the entire grid within its container, not individual items within cells. Now I made some changes here. I have 2 regular grid items, and this second item has a class of special and grid item. And if we go to the styles, we now have grid item.special. We have justify self end, align self start. So basically, this item is aligned different from the rest. These properties override the container's justify items and align items for specific grid items. Now let's talk about responsive design. Responsive design is a fundamental approach to modern web development that ensures websites look and function well across all devices and screen sizes. So let's break this down into detailed, easy to understand concepts. First, let's understand what we mean by responsive. A responsive website automatically adjusts its layout and content based on the screen size. It provides an optimal viewing experience across devices, phones, tablets, laptops, desktops, and it uses fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries to achieve this adaptability. So you always want to start with this meta tag. This meta tag is going to this first section, the content, this is going to tell the browser to match the screen's width in device independent pixels. And then we have this, which is going to set the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded. Without this tag, mobile devices might have a zoomed out version of your desktop site. Mobile first design means that you're gonna one, start by designing for mobile devices, two, progressively enhance the design for larger screens, three, write your base CSS for mobile devices, and four, use media queries to add styles for larger screens. So this is going to be like your base style, but this is how you can create a media query. And so we have the app media, and then when the width gets to 768 pixels, we can create new CSS for this size screens. And when it gets to 1024 pixels, we can again update the CSS for the larger screens. These are called breakpoints. Breakpoints are the screen sizes where your layout changes. Now let's see this example of a responsive layout. If we make this bigger, we can see it switches to 2 columns and now 3 columns. And you can see if the menu starts with the hamburger menu, but then when you go up, it goes to the full menu, the full text, and 2 columns, and then 3 columns. And the third column, there's nothing there. There's no third article, I mean. So we can see we have HTML for the mobile menu, the hamburger menu, and then we also have different HTML for the navigation links, and only one of the other is going to show. And then we have the different cards. So if we look in the style, the base styles are the mobile first. And I also want to talk a little bit about CSS variables here too. So this is how you assign a variable. So now we have container padding is equal to 15 pixels. Grid gap is equal to 15 pixels. So then we can use these variables throughout our CSS, and then we can easily change them at the top, and I'll change them throughout our CSS. But let's keep looking at the mobile first styles. We can see that we're using a flexible layout system with just the Flexbox. We have the columns. And then we have the header style. This is going to be basically the same. But here's where we're using our variable. Padding, if we put var, and then we put the parentheses, and then the variable name right here. It's always, CSS variables always start with 2 dashes like that. And then that's going to just put in 15 pixels for the padding. And then we have our menu toggle. This is display block because this to make it visible on mobile, but it won't be visible when at other sizes, as you'll see. So we have the hamburger display block. Now, if we keep going, we'll see that the nav links are display none. These are hidden in mobile when it's mobile navigation. But if we keep going down, we will see some more variables, like I was saying earlier. And we can see when for the cards, it's just going to be 1 column. Now, this is where we create the media query. When it gets to 768 pixels, we're now going to do display none on the menu, the hamburger menu, and the nav links are now going to be display flex. Also, if we keep going down, we'll see that we now have a 2-column grid for the cards. And then when we get to the desktop styles, we have a 3-column grid. So that's just a practical example of how you can use media queries to make different breakpoints and make your website responsive. Now I'm just going to quickly talk about responsive typography. So here's a way that you can make typography responsive. We're going to use variables to create the base size ratio, and then we are going to create some additional variables to use in a calculation, including the minimum font size in pixels, the maximum font size in pixels, the minimum viewport width, and the maximum viewport width. And then we can calculate the fluid font size. So we have a variable here, and then we're basically calculating what the size is going to be. And the size is going to be based on the viewport. So we can have the base typography, the fluid size. So then we can set the font size that's going to put the result of this calculation. We can also do things like this. This clamp function it clamps a middle value within a range of values between a defined minimum bound and a maximum bound. So there's three parameters: the minimum value, and then we have a preferred value, and then we have a maximum allowed value. So it's going to be able to scale the font to match our screen size. So those are just a few ways of making responsive typography. Now let's talk about CSS animations and transitions. These tools can make websites really come alive. So we'll start with simple transitions and move to more complex animations. The simplest form of animation is a CSS transition. Basically, a transition is like smoothing out a change between two states. And so let's look at this button. If I hover over it, we can see it slowly becomes darker. We could actually make this even more obvious if we change this to a different color. So if we hover over now, you can see it slowly changes to the other color. Well, not super slowly, it does it in 0.3 seconds. But we can change this to 1 second if we want for it to take longer. So now it takes a little longer for it to do the hover. And so the background color is transitioning for 1 second, and there's different types of transition. This one's the ease transition. Now we're going to transition everything, all. And we're going to now transform, and we have a box shadow. So let's see what happens. See, it slowly rises, and you can see a slight shadow appear when it's rising. We can make the shadow darker as well. I'm gonna make it 0.9 or 8. And now it really looks like it's coming off the page. So each of these three items are being animated when we hover. Sometimes we want animations that are more complex or happen automatically. That's where keyframes come in. So let me show you with this simple loading spinner. So the HTML is just this. It's just a div with class loading spinner. And so let's break down this CSS. We have a border radius of 50%. We make one border blue, and the rest of it is going to be light gray. And then the animation property is going to tell it to use our spin keyframes. These are the keyframes that we've defined. And it's going to take 1 second to complete, run at a constant speed. That's what linear means. And it's going to run forever, infinite. But let's look at these keyframes. So the keyframes, which we're defining as spin, that's how what we're naming this keyframe, is going to go from a transform of rotating 0 degrees to a transform of rotating 360 degrees. So it starts at this spot and ends at that spot. We can also use percentages in keyframes for more complex animations. So we just have this div that says pulse me. And if we look at the keyframes, we're going to start at scale 1, then go to scale 1.1, and then go to scale 1. And you can see the percentages: 0%, 50% of the animation, and 100%. So this is going for 2 seconds. So 0% is at the beginning, and then 2 seconds later, we're at 100%. So let's put it all together with this practical example. So we have this card here, and let's look at the styles. The card has is going to, for the transition, is going to transform 0.3 ease, and then also the box shadow we're going to change. And then we can see that we are using this transition. And here's the transform and the box shadow we're going to do on hover. We're also going to, on the hover, the image is going to scale. So let's see what happens. So two things is changing. The card is changing and the image is changing. So now you know the basics of CSS, and you should be ready to start using CSS in your own web projects. Thanks for watching.